In this 50-minute video, we'll be doing a detailed analysis of the package creation process. For a shorter and more precise walkthrough, please check out the video for package creation with the terms quick step mentioned in the title. Okay, so to get started, we're going to go ahead and click the Create New button here, and this will take us to step 1 of the package creation wizard. Now, before we get into all of the inputs, the thing that we want to make sure that people understand is that an archive and an installer file are technically two separate files. However, they are what make up a full package. So when you create a package, it will be a combination of both an archive and an installer and they're both unique in the fact that the installer is bound to the archive and the archive to the installer. Let's go ahead and talk about what is consistent in an archive and an installer file. So if we open up the archive section, we'll see that an archive consists of all your files, including your plugins, your themes, your images, all the WordPress core files, and any files that you actually put in the WordPress root, even if you didn't install the plugin, but they were just your own custom files. An archive will pick up every single file, even if it's a separate application. The duplicator will pick that up. Now, the other thing that it will pick up is the database, and this is going to only be the database of the site that you're working with, and it will be all of the tables. So just keep in mind that an archive consists of all the files and a single copy of a SQL file, which has all of the database create options and all of the data that will be inserted as well. Now, the other file is the installer file. The installer file is simply used to redeploy the archive. And in the event that you're running a actual import install, you will not need to use the regular installer. So the only time you'll need to use the regular installer is if you're running what we call classic install mode. And this means basically you just have an empty directory or even an existing WordPress site and you want to redeploy it by browsing out to the installer. So this should cover basically what a package consists of. Okay, before we get going on all of the inputs here, I just want to make a quick mention of the help up here in the corner. This help has some really useful links. The one I'd like to draw your attention to is the full user guide. This is an online guide that has all the information that we're going through in this video. So for example, say you wanted to look at all of the inputs, it'll have every bit of information that you need about all the inputs are, what they do, how they work. Step 1, 2, 3. There's even a step-by-step section with videos. For example, there's a companion video here. This is just a 7-minute video that is much shorter, but it covers somewhat the similar information that I'm covering here, just in a much quicker detail. So just want to make a quick mention of that, and that is a useful link that you can use. So let's go ahead and get started here with the first input here, which is called the template. Now, a template is very close to what we consider a profile. And what that means is that all the settings that you see on this particular screen can be stored in a template. And the template just basically allows you to enter these inputs very quickly. So let's just jump into a quick example. So right now I have 3 basic templates that I've already set up. One is called a brand, text, and logo. And essentially, if we use the unassigned filter, we'll see that the default branding is set here as default. But if I wanted to change the brand and text template, you'll notice that instantly some of the settings that I pre-configured with that particular template automatically switch over. So it's just an easy way for you to customize how you want to apply specific settings to a specific package build. Another quick example would be all of these filters that I've added specifically for the brand. You'll notice that if we go back to the unassigned, that they're all gone. What the unassigned does is it just remembers the last settings that you ran. So in this case, say I checked 3 boxes here for the storage section, and then I clicked the build button and we went on to the next step, it would remember these 3 options the next time I come to this screen. So the template section is just a way for you to remember the settings from this screen. Now you can also get to the template screen just by clicking on the template list. This will take you to the tools template section, which is where you can edit each one of these particular brands. And if you wanted to edit a brand that you actually have selected, say I had the database only template selected, I can just click the edit button here and that'll take me directly to this template where I can edit it, save it. I could come back, refresh it, and then those values would be applied. So that should be a quick run through of how the template works. Okay, so the next input here is the name, and the name is simply just an identifier for what you want to name the package. There is a quick toggle button here that will put the current date and the name of your current site. If you want to do this, it'll toggle it either direction, name first, date last, or vice versa. So you can also add notes to the various sections. So this can come in handy if you're working with a lot of different packages and you need to keep more detailed information about the particular package. The notes can come in pretty handy. The next section that we're going to look at here is the storage section. So if you look at the little 3 up in the corner, that represents how many storage sections that you have selected. And all this does is upon completion of the build of the package, it's going to store it to these particular locations. Now, if you needed to edit any one of these locations, you can do that simply by clicking the link here. That'll open up a new window, which will allow you to edit the settings of that particular storage item. And storage items are covered in a separate video. So if you wanted to know more about storages, just check out some of those other videos online. Now, the last section in the storage section is a link to your actual files. So if you wanted to see real quickly which files were previously stored on Google Drive, you could open any one of these links, and by clicking on it, it'll open up a new tab. And in the case of OneDrive, it's just going to ask you to sign in. Once you sign in, you'll be able to see the packages that have already been previously stored there. So if you want to go ahead and add a new storage, you can also do that by clicking the Add Storage button down here, which will set up a new storage section. So that should cover most of the information for the storage section. Okay, so the next section that we're going to go ahead and cover here is the archive section. Now, this is probably one of the more important sections on the Setup Wizard. The archive file controls all of the files and the database tables that will be stored from your site. And there are some indicators here that help you quickly identify some things about the archive. The first one is the file format. There's currently a zip format and DAF format, and we'll go over that a little bit more in a second. And then there's 2 other icons here which represent the fact that you have either file folder filters enabled or database table filters enabled. So by clicking on either of the filter enabled checkboxes, we can see that these will show up. And this basically is just a quick indicator for users as they're creating a package to see whether there's filters being applied. So let's go ahead and go through each one of these options in detail. The first one is the engine, and we'll go ahead and click on this link here, which will open up the settings page, and it determines the type of engine that we're going to use to build this archive file. By default, it is set up as zip PHP, and you can control whether it's a single-threaded or a multi-threaded operation. Multi-threaded just means that it will work over multiple page requests, and you can also change the buffer size. This just shows how much buffer will be used when the zip file is being created. Now, this zip archive will create a zip file, as will the shell zip. The only difference between these two is that the shell zip is typically used for Linux systems, and it is using the shell of the Linux to create the zip file. This typically can be faster in most cases and will work better with larger packages. Now, the last option here is the dup archive. This will generate a DAF file, also known as a duplicator archive format. Now, this file is used for larger sites or servers that are typically throttling their processes. It was designed specifically to help with these larger sites. And the format, you can learn more about the format by going to the online help and coming down to this specific FAQ, and it will It will give you information about how to extract the file manually in the event you need to extract it apart from the installer. You can download 3 different types of executables that will help you extract this file manually. So there's more details on the FAQ about that, and you can determine what you want to keep and use as far as the format. So let's go ahead and jump back to the packages screen here, and we'll come back to the archive format. The next input here is the archive only the database. So when we check this, only the database will be archived. No files except for a few minor files will be included in the archive, some core files that you need. But other than that, it's just the database. So this can come in handy if you're wanting to just do database changes. Now, the next input here is enabling file folders and filters. So say you wanted to exclude the uploads directory. You could easily do that by clicking these quick links. And when you apply this particular folder, when the build process runs, it will exclude this folder and all subfolders in it. Now, if you wanted to add additional folders, you can do that. You can manually type them in here. You want to use a semicolon at the end to separate each one, and you'll see that as you add these folder paths, the count here will increase, and you can add as many as you want, or if you don't want any at all, you don't have to apply any. But there is use cases where on one build you might want to apply the uploads, and you want to keep the data here just to store it for later use, but you don't really want to apply the filter. So you can uncheck it here. It'll still save the options as you use the unassigned template again, but it just won't apply the filter. So you can enable the file filters there, and you can also do file extensions. So say you had 2 gigs, 5 gigs of movies, and you didn't want to have to build that package with those particular movies. You could add whatever file extensions you want here, and you can go all the way down to the individual file. Say there were specific files that you just didn't want to include, whether they're personal private files or just large files that you didn't need for the package. So that process can be controlled through the Files tab. Now, the next tab that we have here is the Database tab. And you can control also the database engine mode by clicking on this link. You can click on the SQL mode. There's currently 2 modes that are supported right now, which is one which is built specifically with PHP code, and the other one is MySQL dump. Now, both of these have pros and cons. The default right now is PHP code, but there are some instances where the MySQL dump process works faster on some hosts. So if you're running into any issues with a database build, you might toggle between these two. And other videos will go into a lot more details about these settings, but just know that they're available. So let's go ahead and jump back to our package creation process and our database tab. Now, alongside filtering files, you can also filter database tables all the way down to the table level. Now you're going to see some tables here in red. These are the WordPress core tables, and technically you don't want to exclude these in most cases. There may be some cases that you do. If you do, you need to kind of understand what you're doing and how you're moving data. But any table in red is going to be a WordPress core table. Now, to exclude a table, you simply click a check mark by it and you'll see that it will exclude it. You can use these check all or remove all buttons to check all the tables if you need to. And this is just a clean way to filter out the tables. Now, there is another option down here for compatibility mode. So if we jump back to the settings real quick and we save MySQL dump as the default option, and we jump back to creating a package, we'll see here that there are some options in the database section where we can set. Now, if you want a full overview of all these, you can go ahead and click on this link and it'll run through all the different settings, how they work, and what they might be applied to. On most systems, you don't need to worry about these, but if you're having some troubles moving your site and you're getting into some database errors, you might go ahead and check out this section. It can come in handy, especially if you're using an older, more legacy version of MySQL. So this should cover most of what is done in the archives section. And if you just check out the user guide, all of this information is covered there as well. So the last section that we want to cover here is the installer section. And one point to note is that the installer section values are all optional. So in the event, say you do a bunch of drag and drop import, you hardly ever use the installer, then it probably wouldn't make sense to use these values. However, if you do use the classic install mode where you do use the installer, then filling in these values can be handy in the fact that one, they will help you with certain custom configurations such as branding, and then two, it's really going to help your workflows as far as the pre-fills, so you don't have to keep entering in the same database and user name in the event that you do use the same constant values when you're running an install process, especially say you're using a staging site or something around that particular mode. So let's go through each one of these options. The first option here is the branding option. Now by default, branding, well, before we go into the branding, this particular feature is only available in Freelancer and Business and above. So if you have the personal version, then it would be disabled. So just take note of that if you're actually using the product and you're wondering why it's not enabled. So what branding does is it allows you to customize the installer. And by default, we usually will see this particular mode with the installer. However, say we wanted to add a custom logo or some text, we can easily do that by filling in some values, and you can see here there's a custom text and logo. Now I'm not going to go into details on how to set up the branding, we'll do that in some other videos, but you can kind of get a quick heads up as to what the branding is. And branding can come in handy, say you wanted to create a custom WordPress theme or a custom application for your clients, and you could hand them off an installer file that's branded basically with your business. And so this particular feature can come in handy when you're trying to use that. Now the next option here is the enable password protection, and you'll notice when I check this checkbox that the lock icon up here will stay locked or unlocked, and this can come in handy if you're creating a package and you're running through the screens quickly. You can determine whether this particular installer has a password on it, and what the installer password does is beyond the install wizard. When you start to run that up, you'll see just a password input that you have to fill in before you can enter in any of the other information. And so checking the box will allow you to enter the password. If you need to see the password, you can click the icon over here to show hide, and that is really what you need to enable a password. Now remember that if you are using a hashed installer file name, you don't necessarily need to use the security of the password, but if you want to use both of them, it's a great way to help secure your site, especially when you're working on a public facing site. So just remember that those options are available. Now the next options here are what we call the pre-fill options, and what they do is they just help your workflow. So in the event you use the same database information over and over again, you can put these values in these pre-fills, and then say you jump out to your installer. This is an installer that I created with these pre-fills, and you'll see that the host, the database, and the user are all using those values that are entered in here. So right when I opened the installer, those values were right there, and that can help, you know, with your workflow. So pay attention to those because they can come in handy and help improve your processes. And that can also be done very easily with the cPanel. So in the event you're working on a host that has a cPanel API, you can have all these values pre-filled, and very similar values that you would see with the basic, except the cPanel actually has some other additional options that kind of help speed up your workflow from that end. So if you are using cPanel, check the documentation on this and you'll see that there's some kind of handy features there. Now the last thing that we want to look at here is use current. So if I was to click this, what it would do is it would pre-fill these values with the current WP file of the site that I'm on. So the Snap Creek demo site has a WPCon file associated with it, and it would just fill in those values. So that's just a quick link for you on that. And this should cover everything for the installer inputs. Okay, so now that we have all of our inputs how we want them, we're going to go ahead and go to the next step, which is the scan step, and we get there by clicking on the next button. Now our scan will run very quickly here in most cases. If you have a larger site, it may take some time. So once the scan is completed, you can see what it found on this particular site. Now The thing you want to look for is good on most of these. If you do see a warn, then in most cases you want to dig down into each section and find out what the warning is. You'll see either a check for good, or you'll see a warn message, which will be a gray bubble over here for warn. And you'll notice each one of these checks will either be, you know, a green or a red. So you want to pay attention to each one of those. Now there's some icons up here. The first one here is just taking us to the diagnostics page. So if you needed to gather more information about your setup or anything regarding some of the server settings, you can do that quickly by clicking on that link. That just kind of helps take you to that page quickly. Now, in the event that some of the warnings talked about, you know, database issues or something, you can also click on the site health, which is just a built-in tool into WordPress, and it has some performance and security metrics that you can run. So it's always a good idea to make sure that you run this periodically. So be sure to check that out when you have a chance, especially if you see any warns here. You can run those pretty quickly. So that should kind of give you a high overview of what the scan section does. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and go into a little bit more detail into each one of these sections, just in case in the event that one of these items happens. Hopefully we can cover all of them here. So as you can see here, it's broken up into two major sections. One is setup, which is the system setup, what you have now and what your WordPress is. And there's also the other major section, which is the archive file, which are a lot of the pre-checks that help to create a more stable archive file. And that consists of your files and your database. So this first section that we see here is the setup section. And in here we have the system checks. The first one is the brand check. In this case, you don't really need to pay attention to that one. It shouldn't affect you unless you are using a brand. It'll tell you that. But other than that one, not too much to observe there. The next one is the web server. So in the event you're using a web server that's not in the associated list that you see here, it'll give you a warning. And that doesn't mean that you can't use that web server. In fact, it's best to just go ahead and try the build and see what happens. And in the event that you do run into an issue with that particular web server, just reach out to us with a support ticket and say, you know, we got this warning on this web server, and, you know, can you check it out? And we'll get back with you. Now the next one is the MySQLi, and all this is checking to see if it's actually supported on this server. And the reason why we actually do the check here for the build of the package is that in some cases people will also install on the same server they're on. So it's just kind of a pre-check. The installer has the same check on it, but in the case that, you know, you're trying to build this and it's not having these particular libraries, it's just kind of warning you ahead of time that if you want to try to install on the same server, you're going to run into some issues. Now the next section we got here are a couple of issues associated with Dropbox. Now on the package creation step 1, we checked the Dropbox as an option to where we want to store our archive file. So in the instance that you are using additional remote storages, those might show here, such as Google Drive or OneDrive, but right now we only had Dropbox installed, so it's just doing a couple additional checks to make sure that OpenSSL is installed on this box, because Dropbox needs that, and Dropbox also needs curl, which are some PHP libraries. Now the next set of checks are all really tied heavily to PHP, and the things in here are like PHP version. Right now, Duplicator only works with PHP 5.3.8 and above. So if you're trying to use an older version, it'll warn you there. And in the event that you do have an older PHP system that you're trying to migrate off of, we do have some older plugin versions that do support those older versions. So feel free to reach out to us with a ticket and we can get you a copy of one of those versions in the event that you need to use an older version. Now the next one is called PHP Open Base dir, and this is just a setting that some hosting providers use. And in the case that some of them do use it, it can cause issues on some systems. So If you do get a warning on any of these, like I said before, just go ahead and try the build anyways and see if it works, because in some cases this particular item might show up as a warning, but it still builds fine. So as we recommend, try the build first, and then if you run into issues, then you can come in here and check. And don't forget to always check our FAQ. So say for instance, this PHP open base error was showing a warning. You can easily come over here to our FAQ, type in the related item, and in most cases you'll find something related. And in here we run through a whole different series of things that you can try and work with. So don't hesitate to use the FAQ to try to find some of these solutions. And you'll also see additional links here that link out to various links that can be very helpful. Some will link you to PHP sites, some will link them to our FAQ. But in any case, they're all going to be coming in pretty handy. The next one is max execution time. This particular message doesn't matter so much for the Pro version as it does the actual Lite version. So if you're using the Pro version, you really don't need to pay too much attention to this, unless in the rare event you're trying to use a single threaded mode for your zip archive build. So, which is not set by default. So if you do happen to get a warning on that one, then you'd want to check the settings of the archive engine. The next issue that might pop up is if you're running too low on memory. If you're running under 256 megs, which is basically the default, then you're going to get a warning here. Now, some of your budget hosts and some of your cheaper hosts are going to really kind of ratchet down that number. So it is recommended to use 256 or above. And in fact, the higher your memory, the better off you can just get a better performance overall. So in the event that you can up this, check with your host and see if you can up this particular setting. Now, the next setting here is for the PHP 64-bit architecture. Most modern hosts today all use this, and if you're using something like WAMP or XAMPP, they have 64-bit too. So it's highly recommended that you're working on a 64-bit architecture of this. You run in, if you're still using a PHP 32, you're going to run into file size limits, and it's just going to be an overall slower experience. So if you do see a warning on this one, try to figure out what you need to do to get your current server working in a 64-bit architecture for PHP. So we'll close this section down here. And the next section is the WordPress section, and this is specifically just around WordPress. So right now, as you can see, we don't support WordPress sites below 4.6.0. So it's pretty rare you'll see any of these actually not being checked. This one just checks to make sure the core files are here, and this is just one for multi-site. So these are going to rarely show up as warns. And like I said, if they do, the only one that you might have to really work with is this WordPress version. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next sections here. One thing you'll notice over here is another icon, and this is showing the scan details. So if we click on this and we wanted to get all the settings that we had originally set on step 1, and even our build mode and all the different information, we can see that all here. You'll also see in this particular case what we filtered out, but you notice that we didn't leave any directory or file filters, so it's going to show that none are set. Now we do have what we call auto filters, and what this does is this automatically filters out like other backup plugins or other content caches that don't need to be included in any one of your builds. So all of these values will show automatic filters that are set up. And the last section down here are basically any file extensions. So if you needed to see anything without having to click the back button, you can see a lot of these settings that are set up here in the scan details dialog. Now over here, you're going to see the archive type that it's used. As we've mentioned earlier in this video, there's a zip and a DAF format. This is showing that this particular archive is going to be built as a zip. Now, one thing you'll want to really keep in mind here is that when this scan runs, it's going to show the full size of your database and your files uncompressed. So when this package is built, this number will be usually quite a bit smaller. So if you're wondering why the 120 megabytes is different when the package is actually built, it's because this is everything included that's uncompressed. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at that particular number. Now, the first section that we got here are size checks. And all this section really does is it helps to keep your archive small. In the event, say for example, this was actually, instead of saying this was a large image file, say it was a 2 gig movie file. Well, in most cases, you don't necessarily need to add a 2 gig movie file to your archive. You can move some of those files over later, because just creating that large of an archive file becomes kind of a pain when you're moving things around. Now, you can absolutely create the archive with that 2 gig video file if you want, but it's typically not recommended. So in the event you have a whole bunch of large files, you can check this, and what that will do is it'll enable this add filter button to be enabled. And when you click this, what this will do is it will add this particular file, or say you just collected or clicked on a directory, it'll add that file or that directory to the step 1 filters. So it's just kind of a quick way to add those filters. Now, if you wanted to also get that particular filter in just a quick dialog, you click this clipboard and it'll copy it there, and say you checked like 5 or 6, you can copy all those to the clipboard. In the event you want to go back and just manually do it, you can do it that way as well. So just keep in mind that these filters are all optional and they're just recommendations, and you can pretty much ignore them if you want to include those files. This section will also list basically the uncompressed size, the files, how many directories you have, and the total count there. And clicking on the more details, you can just get more information about this particular section. So the next section is add-on sites. In some cases, people will nest WordPress sites. In this case, we didn't find any, but if it does, it'll tell you, you have a nested add-on site. And if you wanted to, make your archive smaller, you could exclude those as well. The next section is name checks. Now, this isn't much of a problem for the newer PHP 7 versions and above, but for some of your PHP 5 versions, you might run into issues with Unicode file UTF issues. So if you see any of these and you're running an older version of PHP, you don't necessarily have to check them. Typically what we recommend you do is, even if this is a warn and you're on an older version of PHP, try to run the build and then run your install process. And if you run into issues, then come back and filter out these particular checkboxes if they do show up, and that can kind of help with your build process, and 2 with your install process if you run into issues at install time. Now, read checks are just basically files that we won't be able to archive because they're unreadable by PHP. PHP has to be able to read the file successfully to put it into the archive. So if you see any of these here, these are just going to be mentions of those files. There's nothing you can really do apart from fixing it in the actual scan section. You would actually need to go out and use a tool like Chown or Chmod for Linux to change the specific file permissions, or in Windows you can just use your file explorer. So the last section here is the migration status, and this is just a quick check to see if packages created on this server can be migrated to different servers. And so this is pretty rare that you'll see issues in here, but it's just set up for some custom hosts that we've had issues with in the past, and it just tries to do some checks on those. Now over here, you're going to see the size of the database. Of course, this is the uncompressed size. And when we start to drill down into each one of these sections, the first one just pretty much is more of a detail of what your database looks like. And you'll get a warn if the database's size is over 100 megabytes or 1 million records. This doesn't mean that if your database is that large that the process isn't or can't work. It's just saying that you might have to do some additional advanced settings to get the process to move through a little bit more smoothly. So just pay attention to the warnings. A lot of them, if you read all the details, they're going to show you the things that are possibly wrong. Now in the table details section, it'll basically list out all of your tables. It'll show you the size of the database, how many rows are in the database. And this uppercase just shows you whether the table names are in uppercase. On some systems that can cause issues. So it's just going to bring some attention to that in the event that, say, you're moving from one MySQL system to another MySQL system on a different server that doesn't support uppercase. It'll kind of give you a heads up on some of that stuff. So the last section is the object access, and this section is essentially just to show whether the commands for creating a procedure or a function are working. It's kind of an access permission. So if you run into any issues on your server, it'll just note you that. And when you do get a warning, in most cases, this message will change and help you identify what it is that you need to change in order for this particular section to go green for you. So this should cover a good portion of what the setup issues are. Like I said, if you do run into issues, check out the FAQ and the user guide. Read in depth each one of these sections. They'll walk you through most of the details. And then if you still have issues, go ahead and contact us and we should be able to help you out. Okay, once we have evaluated everything in our scan process, we can move to the build step by clicking on the build button. And this will begin the build package process. Now, one thing you'll want to keep in mind when this package is building is that if you've chosen to create a local storage package and a remote package, it will build it for both locations. However, in the event that you chose only a remote storage, then it would simply create the package locally, and then after it pushes it up to the remote location, then it would remove the file from the local system. So that's how it works as far as storage is concerned. And you can see here that the dialogues change slightly as it moves through the process. So now it's actually copying the local file up to Dropbox. And in our case, because we chose to keep two locations, it's going to keep one local here, and then it's going to keep the other one at the Dropbox location. Okay, so now that we have our package created, we can see that there is a new row here. And as you create new packages, you'll see new rows show up. So let's go ahead and get started going through all of the items on the package screen. And we'll start by going up here at the very top. The screen options is a way to control some of the settings on this particular screen. The first setting here is the packages per page. By default, it shows as 15, and what that simply means is that it'll just show you 15 packages on this page. Say you had 300 or 400 and you wanted to see more at once, you could do that. A quick tip on the packages per page: if you have several hundred packages that you want to delete all at once, it's great to come over here to set this to, how many packages you had. Say you had 200, you could set this to 200, and then you could use the bulk action, which we'll talk about in a sec, to check all of the 200 packages and delete them all at once. So that's just kind of a quick tip if you're trying to do a mass bulk delete. The next option that we see here is the created format. So there's several different formats that you can show the created by date, which is right down here, and choose any of those based on your preference. So we'll close that up. And the bulk action, which we just mentioned, the only option that we have right now is to bulk delete. So that is pretty straightforward. The next option is a help. Simply clicking on this help will open up this help too, which we talked about at the beginning of the video. The help has, user guides, FAQ links, and just a whole gambit of information about this screen in particular. And as you move through the creation wizard, it'll change and give you more information about each one of the screens. The next option that we see here is the packages settings screen. Now, when you click on this, it's going to take you directly to the packages setting. Basic settings, these can be used for setting how you want the package to be built. We're not going to go into all the details here. There's some other videos on that. But just note, if you're having some troubles building the package, you might see some recommendations to set some of these options. Advanced settings, typically we don't ask customers to set these unless you're highly technical and you've used the product quite a bit. If you are having troubles with the build, just reach out to the support and we can help you pretty quickly. And the last one is the installer branding, which we went through at the beginning of the video. So we're going to go ahead and jump back to the packages screen and continue through the top bar here. The next option is the templates. This will simply take you to the template screen where you can create a new template. This was used in step 1 of the creation wizard. The next option here is the import. This is simply the same exact menu as we see here, and this will just take you to the import drag and drop wizard where you can drag an archive in here and start the install process from the plugin. The last option here is the recovery feature, and you'll notice that it's kind of a slight red, and the reason why it is because the recovery point has not been set. We'll run through that a little bit later, but when you do set the recovery point, you can easily do that through this menu interface. Once that's set, this color will turn to the same color as these other buttons. It's just kind of a quick reminder that if you're on a site and you don't have a recovery point set, that it's recommended that you set one. You don't have to set one, but it's just kind of a visual indicator. And obviously the last option that we have here is the create new button, which runs you through the whole creation process, which we've talked about earlier. And that will begin the creation process for setting up a new package. So this should cover the top menu bar packages screen. Okay, so let's keep moving along here. The first column that we see here is the type column, and the type column will be of 2 types. It'll either be of manual or schedule, and a manual will show up if you click the create new button and go through the manual creation process. But for sakes of showing the different types, I'm going to jump over to the schedule screen really quickly and do a run now on a database only package that I've already set up with my template. And what this will do is this will just queue up a package, a scheduled package that typically happens automatically, and I'm just running it right now manually. And so when this package is created, it will show a little gear icon. And what the gear icon represents is that it was clicked with the run now. Now, if this package was automatically created through a series of schedules that ran, say we didn't even touch Duplicator for several months, then you would just see the schedule without the gear icon. Your gear icon simply just helps you identify that it was created with the run now. The next label here is the archive type that is associated with the package. There are 2 types. There's the DAF and the zip format. By default, we have zip set up, so these are both zip archive formats. And the last label on the schedule row that we see here is the DB, because we set that template up as a database only package, meaning that I only copied it and created the database into the package archive file, then that little label there indicates that it's only the database. And you'll see that because the size is significantly smaller than all the other files. The last label that you may see on some of these is the recovery point capable, and what that means is that this particular package we can use to set as a recovery point. So you'll notice that over here on the schedule, the recovery point is not going to be able to be set because it's a database only. In order to recover your site, you need all the database and all the WordPress files. So the recovery point basically just indicates that it's a package that's capable of being restored. And you'll see over here on the manual, and it is being recovery capable. So you'll just want to keep those in mind. Say you have 20, 30 packages, you can quickly identify which ones are recovery capable with this icon. Okay, so moving on to the next couple columns, the created column simply is the date in which the package was created or finished being created. The size is the compressed size. Remember, on the scan page, it's a little bit bigger. On here, it's going to be smaller. The name represents just a generic name that you can give the package. You can name it whatever you want. The next column here is more of a workflow column, and is what it's here for is designed to help to improve your workflow. So by default, the installer name is given a hashed name, and you can see that it's added some special characters in here so that people can't necessarily guess what your installer file is when you put it on a public facing server. And this setting can easily be changed by going to the settings, If you wanted to not have a secure installer, which is not recommended, you could save the installer file here. And if we jump back to the packages screen, you'll see that it's just a regular installer file. You wouldn't really need to use the clipboard in this case because you just type in installer.php. However, if you're using a secure installer and you're on a public facing site, then you need to enable this option. And when you go back to the packages screen, you'll see that you can cut and paste this file really quickly. In fact, I'll just do a quick demo of how you might use it. So say you want to move this site to another location. We're going to go ahead and download both of these files. I'm just doing it on my local host. I'm going to move them to a different directory on my local computer, and we're going to download both of those files really quickly. And what I want to do is I want to go ahead and copy the installer name. It's going to copy this full name here to the clipboard. And what I'll do is I'll browse out to my location where I just downloaded both of these files. So when you're on a public facing server, you're not going to see directory browsing enabled. In other words, you can't just come out here and click on this because it's a security risk. If you're on your local host, then most people have this on. It's not going to be an issue. So you're not going to be able to just click on this link and start up the installers. What you need to do is you need to be able to grab the full hashed installer name, which we just grabbed and we put it in our clipboard, and we'll just throw it at the end here. And when we click on this, it'll automatically run to the installer. So that's just a quick way to run through that workflow when you need the installer name. That's the main reason why there's a clipboard here in the installer name section. Now, the next set of items that we see here are the download buttons, and we just showed what downloading both files allows you to do. You can also just click on these and download only the installer or only the archive file. In the case of doing drag and drop import, you're not going to need this installer file. All you would need is the archive file. So you can download that and then use it in the drag and drop. And the one thing you really want to keep in mind here is that the installer is uniquely tied to the archive file. So say you downloaded this installer file and then you downloaded this archive file. Well, when you browse out to the installer, you're going to get a message saying that there's a mismatch. So you always want to make sure that the row that you're on, that you're downloading both files, or you're making sure that you download, files in unison. And sometimes a scenario that users run into is they'll have an archive file that they've installed or saved to some other location, and they need to be able to get the installer file, but the installer file has been deleted from the screen. They don't even have access to it. Well, a quick tip is that you can essentially download this archive file, and inside of that archive file will be a copy of the installer file. It's just called installer.backup. So inside your archive is a full bundle of everything that you need. So that should cover everything that you need for the download button. The next button that you see here is the storage button, and you'll notice that our scheduled is grayed out because when we built our scheduled, we didn't upload anything to a remote cloud storage. However, when we built our first package, we did have a Dropbox location. So we'll go ahead and click on this link here to show just a quick link to some of the packages that we've already created before. So just a quick link. Now, on some instances, you might have to drill down a little bit further to get to the Dropbox or OneDrive, but for most instances, if say you had also backed it up to Dropbox, Google Drive, and OneDrive, you would see those entries in here. There's also a quick test connection button. In the event you were having some issues, you can run back over here and run through all of that and test your connection really quickly. So that is the remote storage button. The last button that we see over here is a series of buttons that will take you to the detail screen, the transfer screen, and the recovery dialog. The first screen is the detail screen, which we'll show here. This is everything you need to know about the package, all the filters that were set up, and everything that was configured for this particular package. So these are all broken down into little sections. There's also a transfer, which takes you to a screen that will allow you to transfer this package to any one of the remote locations that you've set up. So that is all there. And the link that we showed you earlier, the transfer, it's just a quick link to the transfers tab. Now the last option that you see here is the recovery tab, and we'll go ahead and click on this and open this up. Now there's a couple options with recovery that you can do. You can either set the recovery point or set it and launch the recovery point installer. Let's go ahead and just set the recovery point, and we'll see real quickly that it gives us a message that the recovery point's been set. And you'll see that the recovery is no longer in red, and it'll be highlighted because you'll know that this one is the recovery point. You'll see a copy recovery URL to the clipboard, so you can copy that. And as what this does is, if you want to start the recovery wizard, you can easily do that and throw this URL into any browser, and it'll start the recovery point for that particular package. So that's just a quick recovery point. You can get to everything you need recovery wise also by clicking that link, which will take you over to the recovery wizard part. We'll go into this in other videos, but just know that you can get to these items pretty quickly by just going to the recovery options. Now in the schedule one, in the event of the schedule one, you'll just open this up and they'll give you information that you can't set it or launch it, and it'll give you some information about why you can't set that as a recovery point. The last item down here is just the time. The time can come in kind of handy if you're building packages and you just need to correlate the time. Say, did I create my package 10 minutes ago, or so forth and so on, just a quick runner. And this just shows you how many packages you have in your list. So this should run through most of the package creation process and all of the packages. Again, we have some other videos that go into a lot less detail. They're significantly quicker. This one was a full in-depth dive trying to go through all of the inputs. I hope that I covered them all in detail. If I didn't, just jump out to the user guide and you should see information that pertains to each and every one of these settings. So this should cover it for the packages screen.